Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Tracy Bruckner, Senior Director of Public Policy at SAFSF. We're so happy to be here with all of you, and we're looking forward to the day ahead, beginning with this plenary, and then our first SAFSF Hill Day, the Botanical Gardens visit for those of you not attending the meetings on Capitol Hill, and then all of us coming together to cap off the day with our social at the National Museum of the American Indian. It's my pleasure to introduce this morning's plenary conversation, Building Equity into the Fiber of USDA's Practices and Programs, a discussion with the USDA Equity Commission. Just a little background on the Equity Commission. In January of 2021, President Biden signed an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, and committed to creating an Equity Commission as part of his rule agenda and commitment to closing the racial wealth gap and addressing longstanding inequities in agriculture. In March, the American Rescue Plan directed USDA to create the Equity Commission and provided funds sufficient to ensure the commission is well-staffed and positioned to deliver on its charge. The U.S. Department of Agriculture officially launched the Equity Commission in February of 2022 to advise the Secretary of Agriculture and provide USDA with an analysis of how its programs, policies, systems, structures, and practices contribute to barriers to inclusion or access, systemic discrimination, or exacerbate or perpetuate racial, economic, health, and social disparities, and recommendations for action. USDA was the first government agency to create and implement an Equity Commission. 1 year later, in February of this year, the Commission issued their interim report. So to kick off this discussion today, we have Dr. Dewayne Goldmon, if you want to come up here, Dr. Dewayne Goldmon, Senior Advisor for Racial Equity to the Secretary of Agriculture. Dr. Goldman's going to ground us in the role of the USDA Equity Commission plays in guiding USDA to transform our food system and embrace the call for racial justice and equity across agriculture, food and fiber systems, and rural America. Immediately following Dr. Goldman's introductory remarks, Kyeen Hang, president of the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, will lead us directly into the panel discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Goldmon. Previous to his role at USDA, Dr. Goldmon served as the executive director of the National Black Growers Council, a Washington, D.C. based organization that advocates to improve the efficiency, productivity, and sustainability of black row crop farmers. He has more than 30 years of experience in the agricultural sector and is also a farmer in Southeast Arkansas. So please give a big welcome to Dr. Goldmon and the panel.
Thank you, Tracy. Is this working?
Yeah.
I'm kind of clumsy, so I don't want to spill my coffee on myself, so I'm going to just move out front a little bit if that's okay. So thank you all. Pleasure to be here in front of this illustrious group again. Tracy just shared with you about half of the comments that I was going to make, so I'll just kind of, and thanks for doing that. I was asked to try and put the Equity Commission in perspective with the overall equity work that's going on at USDA. And I'll try and do that, and I'll try and be brief, because we've got some experts here that you really probably want to hear from, okay? Some of our Equity Commission members, so really want to thank you all for coming, and Margot as well. Let's frame this up, okay? So it's hard to talk about this administration without talking about the turbulent year that this country, this world experienced in 2020. I just retired from Bayer. I was executive director of this nonprofit. And if I say things like George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, it rings an unfortunate bell. There was some unrest, so much so that the country really took a hard look at racial justice and equity. And when this administration came in, very deliberately said that this is something that we're going to do something about. So Executive Order 13985 did exactly what Tracy said. It said that racial justice and equity will be a pivotal priority for the Biden-Harris administration. President Biden looked among his cabinet and said, I want all of you all to look at this and figure out how you're going to do it. So for the first time, USDA decided to have a senior advisor working on racial justice and equity. Soon after I started, the American Rescue Plan was signed into law. March 11th, 2021, a number of resources in there for the department. One of the things that was in there in section 1006 was USDA, you will stand up and work with an equity commission, okay? This commission will be a panel of experts, and it's not just your typical committees that you normally stand up. It's not just farmers and ranchers and landowners. We want people that are running major civil rights organizations, food distribution systems, economists, lawyers, all these things, because we really want to challenge USDA to do something that's going to stand the test of time, something that will be visible long after this administration is gone. And that's an awesome challenge, but we embrace it fully, and we're making steady progress towards doing that. So when the American Rescue Plan was tweaked and certain portions of it were repealed and some were replaced and modified, the Equity Commission was essentially left alone. That it was already up and operating, and so it continued to be supported by the Inflation Reduction Act in section 22007. They met for the first time in February of 2022. Let me make sure I get this right, because we spent a long time in 2021 trying to make sure that we did the outreach and positioning to get the right kinds of people on board so that they could do the right kinds of things that's needed to make those permanent changes. So they met for the first time in February 2022. They meet about quarterly. These are very public meetings managed by the Federal Advisory Committee Act rules. And a couple of months ago, they released the interim recommendations. And I think we'll share some details with you on those interim recommendations here shortly. For food distribution, if you look at the last four, there's 32 recommendations, and a couple of things I want to point out. One, the goal of the Equity Commission is to provide what we describe as actionable recommendations to the Secretary of Agriculture. Recommendations that will permeate throughout the department to make sure that we're making those meaningful changes. And they cover a wide range of things. We also have an agricultural subcommittee because we are keenly aware of some disparities in our ag programs. Who we are, the way we show up, the way our farmers and ranchers across all sectors either access or are denied access to programs, and we have to address those barriers. So we were aware that the Ag Subcommittee was stood up simultaneously to the Equity Commission. As we got into this work, we were also made aware of some disparities in our rural community, rural development type program. So the Rural Community and Economic Development Subcommittee met for the first time in September of 2022, and we're working feverishly to get them on schedule with the Ag Subcommittee so that before the end of this year, we'll be able to finalize those interim recommendations and provide those actionable recommendations to the Secretary. I understand this conference, we're focused on food and food distribution. If you've heard the Secretary talk in the last year, you've probably heard him talking about building an agricultural system from the bottom up and the middle out, creating food networks, food distribution systems that actually allow dollars to be circulated more times in our rural communities, providing healthy and nutritious foods for more of our populations to help with a number of things, addressing food insecurity. So if you look at those last four recommendations, and you look at the goals of this organization, they align pretty closely. We have to be serious about the way we resource our food systems, and we are looking forward to working with the Equity Commission and organizations like this to make sure we get it right. Because this is not a flash in the pan where we want to be proud of some recommendation that we've made. This is more of a sustained effort where we want to be proud of these things being here 20, 30 years from now. So thanks, Tracy. I won't hold you long. Thanks for the opportunity to make just a few comments to you. Look forward to participating with you the rest of the morning, and I'll be around for support as we start talking about the Equity Commission. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Goldmon, for framing our conversation this morning. Good morning and welcome to all of you to our morning plenary. My name is Kayin Heng, and I am proud to be able to moderate this session. I am a former member of the SAF-SF board and currently serve as the Senior Vice President for Programs and Partnership with the Sierra Health Foundation and the Center Sierra Health Foundation. We are a private health foundation based in Sacramento, California. I will be serving as a moderator for this plenary. Let me start off by saying that equity in farming is something that I have deep passion for because I grew up farming with my family in Minnesota. My parents rent 5 to 10 acres for as long as I can remember and grew fruits and vegetables which they sell at the local farmers market. Like many Hmong farmers in the Twin Cities, my parents' hard work and ingenuity transformed the dying farmers market system and turned them into some of the best farmers market in the country. This transformation spurred the local food movement in the state and contributed to new growth and innovation for international food companies like General Mills, which is based in Minnesota. But so often, BIPOC farmers grow the food and spearhead the innovations in farming, but they're often left out of the wealth creation that occurs. Growing up, I saw firsthand the challenges my parents and other Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers face when trying to access long-term land, when trying to find markets for their fruits and vegetables, when trying to access farm credit or additional training and research to improve their farm operations and build intergenerational wealth. Historically, we know that the US government has often been one of the main obstacles for BIPOC farmers, from denying them ownership of their land to denying loans to maintaining their farms. I remember my parents having to rent land from a white landowner who charged them not one, but 3 times what he was charging other white farmers who were renting their land. And the landowner insisted that my parents allow him and his extended family and friends to come on the land and harvest whatever they want, free of charge, at any time. This was an actual condition of the lease, which the landowner would never allow to be written on paper. I also remember waking up on Saturdays and Sundays at 2 a.m., rushing to the farmer's market in the early morning, dark, and waiting around for hours until the farmer's market lottery began, and we could be assured a farmer's market stall to sell our veggies. And even then, if it was rainy or July 4th and the crowds were small, we would have to take back all the veggies we grow and go back home with just a few dollars in our pockets. This is the injustice, inequity in our farming system, and it needs to stop. When President Biden took office in 2022, as Tracy and Dewayne mentioned, he created the Equity Commission and its subcommittees to ensure USDA be a diverse, inclusive, and accessible federal agency for all farmers throughout this country. I'm proud to say that my younger brother, Jansen Heng, as the executive director of the Hmong American Farmers Association, serves as a member of the Committee on Agriculture and has been a passionate voice for immigrant farmers to get access to opportunities that will help them build intergenerational and community wealth. This morning, we will hear from the USDA's commitment. We will hear about the USDA's commitment to racial equity by talking to a few members of the USDA Equity Commission members. We will hear about how the Equity Commission works and the unprecedented opportunities in front of the USDA to create equity and wealth for generations of BIPOC farmers to come. My hope is that the Commission will be able to tackle many of the challenges my family and many others face, and in turn, seed a generation of vibrant and prosperous BIPOC farmers. So thank you for being here today, and let's get started. So I am joined on stage by 3 amazing individuals. I am sorry and send regrets from Tony Stranger McLaughlin, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Native American Agriculture Fund. Unfortunately, she is sick and could not be here with us today, but I know she is very much with us in spirit. But let's go ahead and start from my left, and we'll make it down the line. To my immediate left is Margot Schlanger. She is the Senior Advisor at the USDA Office of Congressional Relations, and you all, a nominee for USDA Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. She's not yet confirmed, but let's all channel good thoughts into the universe for Margot. Next to Margot is Charlotte Ammons, and she's the Program Director at Farm Aid. And last but not least is Derek Johnson, who is the President and CEO of NAACP. So let's get started. I'm going to invite each one of you to share a little bit about yourself. Tell us briefly about what brings you to this space, what guides your involvement, engagement with the USDA Equity Commission and the constituency you're representing, and what you work on. So with that, let's start with Derek first.
I was hoping you would. So, Derek Johnson, NACP president. So, I'll tell people, I'm a guy who grew up in Detroit and live in Mississippi and like tomatoes. That's the most I know about agriculture. But when you talk about the issue of equity, I come from a family that migrated from the south to the north, and everybody had a garden, and they grew food. But then all of a sudden, you begin to see a change in my neighborhood as the next generation came about. But when I moved to Mississippi, what was most stark was the lack of black-owned farms and the lack of markets for those black farmers who actually was able to hold on to their land. And the more I began to study the issue, I realized that the corporate growers was pushing so many people out of the market. So much so that you're hard pressed in certain areas with some of the most fertile soil in the state, some of the most fertile soil across the southern black belt, that no one is growing anything because there's no market. There's no opportunity. And it's really interesting to listen to your story about the farmers market in Minnesota, because I was expecting to have these prospering farmers markets in the South, and for the most case, they don't even exist. It's like going to the Caribbean island. You name the island, and you find that the price of produce and other agriculturally grown food is 3-4 times more expensive because they're importing everything on the boat. And yet the soil there is so rich, they cannot grow it. The issue of equity is not only based on ethnic background and race and gender, it's also a question of the corporate growers who have raided the culture of growing food and being sustainable. That is a problem. It's a problem so much so that you have in some areas, you have young people who are malnourished and they are living on top of fertile soil. So the real question of equity is not only African Americans and Hmong and other farmers having a market to take their produce and not being exploited because they are unable to purchase land and they're being charged 3-4 times more for the land. The other side of that question is the equity when you talk about local growers versus the corporate raiders. And at some point in this nation, on this globe, we're going to be confronted with a food crisis like we've never seen before. Because even some of the food that I am eating, and I love a good cucumber, I don't know what I'm eating anymore because it's been so genetically modified and stripped of the real nutrients that when I'm eating something I bought from a grocery store here and I happen to be blessed enough to travel abroad, it tastes so much different. And so the question of equity we must wrestle with, not only as the Department of Ag or the grower community, is what values in food will we want to promote and push forward? Will it be a value of maximizing profit and exploiting people and malnourishing children? Or would it be a value of resetting the ecosystem so local farmers can actually have an opportunity to provide quality food to the residents that live within 100 miles radius?
Thank you, Derek. Charlotte?
What he said,
Ditto?
what you said. The thing that I've learned, and as I hear both of you speaking, the thing that I'm reminded of is that inequity is not an irony. We exist in a culture where, the people who are growing our food also can't afford to purchase it. Mm-hmm. That's not ironic. That is a condition of a systemic issue. The young people who sit in, front and center in our rural communities, we hear this mantra of young people don't know where their food comes from, but where I come from, I grew up with young people who absolutely knew where their food came from because they were getting out of school early. They could not complete the school year because they had to go to the fields and pick cucumber or barn tobacco, or, you know, so that's not an irony, that's systemic. And so when you ask me why I'm here because I'm the granddaughter of a sharecropper turned tenant farmer. When you think about tenant farming, you think about that era of farming and agriculture, and labor was legit the currency, you know. Our granddaddy paid for our rent through his labor. I mean, no directly, no indirect. You work, you get money, you pay your rent. No, you work, that is your rent. Mm-hmm. The ability to access the land is your rent. Your labor is your lease, and that came with all kinds of other issues and challenges and barriers and violence and trauma. And so as I grew up coming from rural eastern North Carolina, seeing that over and over again, understanding that I'm one of those kids that had to get out of school early in order to go to the field. But then also seeing the dynamic of me and my aunts, you know, taking the tobacco, handing it off the what we call trucks. But then there's this young white kid who our family is like, yes sir, to, who is on the tractor, you know. So that, just even that image alone of that hierarchy that exists when it comes to the fallacy of the culture of white supremacy that we exist in, that kind of dictates these markets that Mr. Johnson just described. So that's one reason. Also, I'm a children's librarian by trade. I went to graduate of North Carolina Central University in library science. So I believe in intellectual freedom. I believe in people's right to have the information so they can make an informed choice. And we see institutions like the USDA, one of the biggest barriers was and still is, to be honest, is getting information out to the people who need it most so they can make an informed decision, an informed choice about how they can enter and access the resources that they so rightfully deserve. So I'm here because I think there's a lot of rectification, if you will, and remedying that can be done within these systems so that people who have been most disenfranchised by them can make an informed decision, whether they decide to enter and mess with the USDA after years and years and years of trauma and violence should be their choice. So I want to give them the platform, or at least work with this amazing commission to be able to give those folks the opportunity. If they didn't still want the opportunity, I would not be here. So that's why I'm doing this today.
Thank you. We're very glad.
Yes,
you're
ma'am.
here. Margot.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I came to USDA because, let me say this differently. I started my career as a civil rights lawyer, and particularly working on systemic reform of jails, prisons, and police departments. So that's a pretty long distance between that and food and farming. But it's not that long a distance because the issues are issues of justice and exclusion and making sure that the people of this country are the governors, not the governed. And so I came to USDA. I've most of my career, I've done different things, but most of my career I've been a law professor. It's nice to have a fellow Michigander on the stage. I teach at the University of Michigan when I'm not in the federal government. And my work outside the academy and inside the academy has focused on how one gets large, especially governmental institutions, to care about civil rights. What are the levers? What are the processes? What are the kind of modes of enlisting outsiders to prompt the insiders to do better? How can that actually be operationalized? That's the thing I care about. I cared about it for jails and prisons and police departments, and I care about it at USDA, and that's what brought me to the department. I am currently assigned to work on programmatic equity across the department, and that intersects in pretty obvious ways with the Equity Commission. Most concretely, when the department says yes to the recommendations that the Equity Commission is making, the commission and all of you want to know, how does that yes actually turn into action? How do we get from a word to an action? How do we get from a word to change? And the equity planning process and monitoring, self-monitoring, reporting, et cetera, all of that, that's not the only way that that happens, but it's a really important way. And so that's the set of contributions that I try to help steer and lead. And so that's what got me here.
Great.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Margot. So let's start off with a question for Derek. So Derek, how have rural Black communities been impacted by climate change? And how can we ensure they see themselves in the future of sustainable agriculture?
I think climate change impact rural Black communities with a multiplier effect. With the frequency of tornadoes that in areas that we wasn't not prepared to see it as frequent, with the flooding that have taken place, you have communities who are less equipped to withstand the harms of those disastrous events. I think about Rolling Fork, Mississippi. Tornado came through, something that no one would have expected. And when I went to Rolling Fork, it reminded me of Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. People talk about New Orleans and Katrina. They were impacted by the residual flooding, but the actual area of the storm hit on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It was devastation. But the ability of those communities to recover was amazing to watch because they had resources, information, and insurance. And many of them owned structures. And so the recovery was different. Now, those who were on the Gulf Coast, working class Blacks, working class whites, and the substantial Vietnamese community on the Gulf Coast, that was a lag in that process. So much so that when you have a federal response and they are sending a boatload of money, and they only target one economic strata of individuals for recovery, you have a whole ecosystem of people who live whether on their boats or they are home renters who monies were being completely diverted away from that. So climate change will have the impact, but the other side of the impact is the lack of equitable response. And so the state of Mississippi, we had to sue them for diverting $400 million from home rental assistance so people can come back. We were successful in that lawsuit, but I'm beginning to see what happened with Katrina in Rolling Fork, Mississippi, where you have a vast number of individuals in this rural community who were not homeowners. They were all but tenant farmers living in shacks. They would never come back to that community. Because climate change and all of these occurrences that's having a devastating impact on everyone, the recovery from that is something that is inequitable, and it's unimaginable to see what's going to happen to some of those families 10 years from now.
Yeah, absolutely. Charlotte, can you please tell us about the importance of an organization like Farm Aid engaging in the Equity Commission? What is the Commission's potential for impact on BIPARC farmers and communities?
So I want to add to what Mr. Johnson was saying. Like my grandma, Hattie Adele Ammons, went through Hurricane Hazel back in the 60s, you know, and I think there's a residual effect that and you know, when it relates to environmental justice, climate change. Hurricane Hazel, there's probably some scientists in the room who know way more about this than I do. But Hurricane Hazel was seen as a benchmark hurricane because it was just completely unpredictable. It was kind of a sign of the impending chaos that climate change caused in weather. But I say that to say one result was her, from that one experience, and she was 30-something, and by this time, my grandma had 12 kids. She had about half of them by then, and one of them was my mama. But from that day on, every roll of thunder she spent in the closet. So nobody talks about the traumatic impact of that I personally relate to climate change. It affected my grandmama to the point that it was a very psychological, emotional, and spiritual impact on the way that she existed. And the entry point for an organization like Farm Aid, and folks know Farm Aid, you know, for our founder Willie Nelson, and we put on probably one of the best shows in the in the country once a year. Maybe I'll see some of y'all there this year. But there's also this other Farm Aid. As a result of that amazing show, we bring people together. We can also resource farmers and organizations that support farmers around the country, and one way we do that is through some stress assistance and crisis and disaster assistance. When you know, federal institutions are kind of dragging their feet to get there, Farm Aid can be way more immediate and get to the communities way quicker. And some of those communities are some of the communities that Mr. Johnson mentioned around the country. So that's one role that Farm Aid has done a great job over the years in playing, is to be that more immediate response when you live with that level of distrust in these institutions that have not showed up for you on time when these emergencies happen, but you have a place to lean on in a nonprofit like Farm Aid, who has shown up continuously over the years and on behalf of farmers who have been disenfranchised in that way. Another role is, if you look at the first maybe 3 recommendations or 4, they all deal with land loss and land recovery, which has been a systemic issue, particularly in the South and in black communities. So that feels really important, because I'm also on the board of Land Loss Prevention Project based in Durham, North Carolina. So that feels very, very vital to folks being able to stay on the land, and also to dispel and counter the myth that black folks don't want to farm or people of color don't want to be back. We're an agrarian people. It's innate to many of us, and so we should have that opportunity to remain on our land. So I'm so grateful to see some of those recommendations that work directly to keep people on their farms.
That's great, Charlotte. And Margot, one of these organizations that Charlotte referenced in terms of organizations where communities of color and BIPOC communities have strong distrust is the USDA, right? And given your amazing civil rights background, talk to us a little bit about how you see USDA moving forward so that the communities of color can trust and participate in all of the programs and opportunities offered through USDA.
Thanks. I can't do it by heart, but the USDA mission statement talks about providing resources and services for all Americans. And that's a promise that, you know, goes deeply back into USDA's history. President Lincoln, who founded it, called it the People's Department, but it hasn't been a promise that we've lived up to. I mean, so we need to, at the department, we need to look into that promise and see it as not an add-on and not a thing that we do at the edges, but as the basic mission of the department is to provide what people in rural America, what people on farms and ranches, what people who are in need of nutrition assistance, to provide them what it is that they need to flourish. And I actually think that's the key. The key is to not see equity as an add-on. The key is to see it as owning our actual mission. And if we can do that, if we can own it as our actual mission, then there's a lot of bureaucratic details that need to happen, right? I kind of embrace bureaucracy, so which makes me not a normal person, I know. But I believe in it. I believe in planning, and I believe in reporting out, and I believe in accountability, and I believe in the bureaucratic levers that make enormous institutions like USDA with 100,000 people who work there, that make them turn. But I think at the core is to say, this is not an add-on. This is actually what we do. This is what we do. And we have to say it and we have to mean it. We can't mean it if we don't say it. We have to say it, we have to emphasize it, we have to own it, and then we have to live up to it, but we have to set it as the North Star.
That's great, Margot. I'm going to stick with you for a little bit. So given that that is the vision, right, to truly create USDA to be that people's agency, what do you see as some of the biggest challenge in realizing that vision? Is it legislative frameworks? Is it lack thereof of capacity, infrastructure? What will need to be addressed? And let me also add, furthermore to
Because
that.
that wasn't a big enough
That was
question.
not big enough. Let me ask, and you get this all the time as a professor. You probably do this all the time as a professor, multi-questions. Charlotte referenced a couple of the recommendations from the Equity Commission. So let me ask, how do we ensure that there are teeth, right, to the Commission's recommendation?
Right. So let me actually start with that last piece. That's always the danger of a multi-part question, right? Is that then you just get an answer to the last piece. But I think that some things are very hard to operationalize. Like living up to the idea of being the people's department, like that's really big, kind of hard to get your head around. I'm totally committed to it, my colleagues are committed to it. I don't mean that it's unimportant, I just talked about how important it was, but hard to operationalize. Some things are a lot less hard to operationalize. We need to make sure that farm lending doesn't require a graduate degree to fill out the form. That's not, I mean, sure, it's hard. I mean, don't get me wrong, everything's hard, right? Like somebody has to sit there and they have to redo the form and they have to make sure we're still getting the information that's needed to run a process that complies with the limits Congress has put on it. And we have to, I mean, I don't mean that it's easy, it's hard, like jobs are hard. But it's not, it's a doable thing, it's an operationalizable thing. I think that what we need to do is you know, what's the phrase? What's the animal that we eat bite by bite? I don't remember. Eat the cow? Eat the elephant. Who wants to eat an elephant? Well, we need to eat whatever it is that's tastier than an elephant, bite by bite, right?
Country, and I ain't even heard of that one.
We really do. We need to eat it bite by bite. We need to like carve it up, and we need to say, okay, farm lending. What are we going to do in farm lending? And then we need to say base acres. What are we going to do about base acres? And we need to say access to SNAP. How are we going to make access to SNAP unstigmatizing, easily available, and let people get at all of the food that they want and need to flourish? And we need to take it in bite-sized steps. We need to plan. We need to notice how the plans are going. If they're not succeeding in their objectives, we need to say, oops, need to plan some more. And then we need to do it again. I have this graphic that I use all the time, and there's no PowerPoint here, so I can't show it, but it's a circle. It's not a complicated graphic, right? We need to plan, we need to notice how the planning's going, we need to look at disparities and barriers, we need to remove the barriers, we need to plan again. We need to notice and we need to plan again. And that's how you do it, I think.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I think your recommendation about making applications more accessible, easier, that's not only to USDA, I think that's a message for my entire colleague in the philanthropic community, right? We often hear that from our community partners. The next question is one for either Charlotte and Derek or both of you. And so that is, how are you engaging grassroots communities around policy advocacy and power building? What are you hearing from the ground about what it is needed to undo historical and systematic barriers, harm faced by BIPOC communities in the sustainable agriculture world?
Good question. It is a Farm Bill year, so there's a lot of energy, of course, around the Farm Bill. And that means big P policy, but we also deal with small P policy, like grassroots, like everyday lived experiences, what people are experiencing on the ground. So the way that we engage it is simply by listening, and then what we would call visiting. Just going and sit with folks and hearing from grassroots organizers, particularly in rural spaces. And, I often think about how our institutions are established, and to be able to go from the last plantation to the people's house. What is that, how do you fill that gap except for build power amongst the people who are most affected? And so to ensure that they have what they need, someone really, again, much smarter than me, told me that equity is the floor beneath which no one should fall. So if I hold that line in terms of the work that we do as an organization, that we hold this line of where that floor is, knowing that there are going to be cracks in that floor, how do we make sure that people's lived experience, and to me that's where that small p policy comes in, the lived experience of people is represented. So we've been listening to folks talking about, water quality issues, particularly via the vehicle of CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, particularly in rural communities. So addressing that, everybody, and then try to create a message from that everybody can get behind and relate to and understand. Everybody wants clean water. Nobody wants issue water. Nobody wants ish in their water. It's a very basic concept, but when we see the people who are continually being pummeled by these types of environmental injustices, it's the same folks. And what we're also seeing now at this point, a lot of the policies that were put in place to specifically disenfranchise Black and brown communities have now spilled over into white communities, particularly poor white communities as well. So we have a shared front now to be able to stand on and to make sure that we're all looking out for each other at this point, because as we can see, the ism applies to all of us. We know that it most directly affects the people who it was intended and designed to, but at the same time, it's also indirectly affecting a lot of rural places all over this country. And I really do hate that Tony's not here to represent, so I'm sure she would have a lot to say about how it's affecting indigenous communities and Native communities all over this country as well.
That's right, and your reminder that what impacts one of us affects all of us, and that is incredibly important. Derek, what are you hearing from the ground?
So there are layers to this, right? I love it when you talked about waters. I can recall when a large hog producer was trying to move these mega farms across the South, and a group of us stopped them from coming into 2 different states by getting people to recognize that these hog producers come in, it's going to pollute the water. And when it's always going to create jobs, they said, wait a minute, we don't want that aroma, nor do we want our water to be impacted. And so that was an organizing thing that I can recall. And so there are some regulatory requirements in order for us to do well and do good, and we have to stop allowing corporate interests to undermine our ability to do well as communities so they can do good in their profit margin. And so there are some policy things that need to be in place. And it was funny of you to say, I love bureaucracy. I pulled my hair out of bureaucracy, but some bureaucratic efforts are necessary to sustain equal balance so people can live a healthy existence. Beneath that, the Farm Bill is going to be critically important. From school nutrition, I can't say that to this group, y'all know that better than I do. And so we are now taking serious looks at the Farm Bill and what areas in the Farm Bill we have to make sure that the African American community is protected from, or our interests can be advanced. And oftentimes when we do that, it's not just African American community, because when we see the ecosystem, if you do right by the African American community, it's going to impact everyone else. The number one benefactor of affirmative action have always been white women. But we understand the importance of affirmative action. So most of what we do impact the broader community, but we start from our center of gravity. And then the big issue is, if you have governmental sanctioned harm, you have to have governmental sanctioned repair. Some people call it reparations. If Black folks' land was taken by the government, Black farmers should be made whole from that taking. Full stop. And none of us should feel as embarrassed, say, well, reparations is a bad thing. No, it is. If you have governmental sanctioned harm there should be governmental approaches to repair that harm. And no one should be apologetic about it, and we should embrace it, because if it happens to us today, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 80 years ago, it will happen to your community soon. And so at some point, we have to get out of this notion that doing something to repair the harm of one community is somehow harmful to the greater society. No, it makes the greater society a better place. And for the NACP, we have always focused on how to make whole those black farmers who have never been made whole. Mm-hmm. Even with the settlement, it was a pittance to the harm that was actually caused.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you, Derek. You know, the remarks from my three colleagues up here reminds me of Margaret Mead's quote, right? Never a doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it is because of the small group that we see change. So you can see, and you've heard from three amazing folks representing a small group who's been charged with bringing and making sure that equity exists in what is to be the People's Department. So please join me in thanking the three panelists up here for their remarks. And now is the time for us to open the floor for questions for the audience. So don't be shy. There we go. There are two mics roaming. Virginia's got the first mic. Please introduce yourself and where you're joining us from.
Hi, my name is Mark Watson. I'm president of Pot Liquor Capital. We work with Black, Indigenous, and other farmers of color nationally. I appreciate the North Star and the framing of what should happen. And it's a little confusing for me to expect an organization that's been shaped by corporate interests and lobbyists and other entities globally to change itself. I realize the commission has a charter to sort of highlight the inequities and try to urge policies to change. But you also need external entities that represent the communities that are being impacted to foster that change. So I'm wondering, what are the connection points that the USDA can foster with organizations outside of the USDA to sort of move this along?
Margot, do you want to take that? Or?
I'm looking at Dr. Goldmon, who just is dying to talk to this. I could see it.
Can you turn me on? Mr. Watson, thanks for the question. I should have explained a little more that was one of the central focal points for the Equity Commission. When you look at USDA and our checkered history, it's not reasonable to assume that we could do this internally for a couple of reasons. One, we generally operate from and you might have heard me say this, we generally operate from a position of distrust, okay? The people that we need to help fundamentally don't trust us. And that distrust, most cases, it's painful to say, but it's warranted because we haven't shown up the right way. And so the Equity Commission said, let's go out and talk to those people. Let's get representation from those people who have been left out of certain discussions. And let's see what this equity could look like if we fully acknowledge that we haven't done a good job of doing that and listen to them as they develop these recommendations. That's a critical part of the work that we do. To Margot's point, but it doesn't stop there. So the Equity Commission is one of three central pillars that works with our civil rights, and I'll have to say the Office of Tribal Relations because of the sovereign nature of our Native American brothers, sisters. We have to be respectful of that. But you have the Equity Commission, you have programmatic equity, and another important part of that is DEIA, making sure that the right people are there implementing these programs and working with our people. Because when we get into the serious work, you understand that who we are is just as important as what we're doing. So here, having representation from those people who traditionally have not been at the table when these decisions are being made, when these rules and regulations are being developed, it has to be part of this process. We rely on the Equity Commission to provide that kind of outside experience, expertise, and the expertise from someone who's been left out is really what's needed here. When a person has suffered from discrimination in trying to access a program, if you can get that person to talk to you, that's valuable information. And I share that from none other than personal experience, okay? When the color of your skin impacts your ability to access a program, that's a feeling you never forget. And if you're human, that's a feeling that you don't want other people to have to go through. So incorporating that outside influence and getting those people, if you really want to know how to fix something, find somebody who's really pissed off. And they will tell you, if you can get them to share with you their experiences and listen. Because a lot of times we think this is kind of a zero-sum game, that in order for us to provide equity, that somebody has to give up something in order for the people that have been left out to get something. And I submit that that's false. That if we're thinking about equity, and equity, while I got the mic, equity is a little different from equality. If you've heard me talk before, you've heard me talk about the apple tree, and imagine there's an apple up there that's 8 feet. And if I'm 6 feet tall, you give me a 2-foot ladder, I'm fed. But if I'm 5 feet tall, and you give me a 2-foot ladder, I'm a foot short, and I'm still hungry. So equality says give everybody a 2-foot ladder. Equity says give people what they need to access the resources that are needed for USDA to deliver equitable programming. And Mr. Watson, that comes from listening to those people whose ladders have traditionally been a little too short to access those programs. Thank you.
And I would say if you visit the recommendations, you'll see all those recommendations come from long-held organizations who've been doing this work for a long. I don't work for the USDA. None of us, obviously, and none of us on the commission work directly for the USDA. And we do at all of our public meetings. We do. Speaking of pissed off people, have oral public comments, and I don't think people take advantage of that enough. I think making sure that people's voices are definitely in the room, and it's most likely people who've been bleating out for a very long time. But to have those voices in the room, and so that we can hear from those folks, one, legitimizes what we keep hearing over and over and over again. So when that call comes out, I really do encourage people to sign up for those public comments.
Absolutely. Questions? Richard?
Good morning, everybody. Richard Elmhill, First Nations Development Institute. We serve Native communities across the country. One of the things that we run into is just kind of explaining some of the gaps in between the things when we're working with Native communities. So a common question they come up with is, how did you come up with how do you categorize Native communities, which is usually reflected in the boundaries that were created? And the answer to that question, I feel like, should be common knowledge, not just for Native communities, but for a room like this, especially considering Native communities have been put in boxes and have a history with boundaries, making that clear of why those are created for the people, and just adding a little clarity to what's I find is a common foggy area for the average person in Native communities and those that we work with.
Thank you.
Derek or Charlotte, would you like to take that question?
Charlotte?
I didn't hear the question.
I didn't hear the question.
I thought it was
Richard?
public comment.
Yeah, let me reflect back what we think we heard from up here is that the question is, how has the Equity Commission defined communities and population? Is that right?
How has the Equity Commission helped define and categorize Native communities?
The good thing about the commission, it truly is representative of many communities. So the Equity Commission within itself is not defining Native American community. They're representative from the Native community at the table. And we also recognize, just like with the African American community, it's not a monolith. And so there are representatives. It's not only one person. There are several people at the table who have different perspective concerning the Native American population.
Thank you, Derek. Any other questions? Back in the middle?
Thank you. I'm Steve Roach from Food Animal Concerns Trust. I live in Iowa. One of the things I'm concerned about is that 98% of the farmland in the U.S. is controlled by white people. And one of the things I see is that if you have farm programs that are primarily supporting existing land owners and protecting the rights of landowners and supporting landowners, what I'll see in Iowa, what we see is farmland now is maybe $20,000, $30,000 an acre. And if you want to grow corn and soybeans, you need $500 to $1,000 an acre. That creates a huge barrier for people to actually enter farming. And what I see is a lot of USDA programs, by supporting existing farmers, is driving up the property value, and basically it's making it more and more difficult to actually have new farmers come in and also increase the diversity of it, because the programs are primarily targeted towards existing landowners. And what that does is makes it much harder for new people. And what we find now in Iowa is there's a huge amount of people that own the land, and then a lot of the land's actually worked by people leasing the land. So people are holding on to the land, sticking, and there's all kinds of policies around that basically reward you if you're a landowner and a big landowner. So I'm wondering, how have you all addressed that issue of 98% of the land is already owned in white hands? How do we change that, and how do we address the programs that support farmers? Subsidies basically are a gift from the government to landowners. So how do we address that problem? Because it really creates a huge barrier for people to be able to enter into farming.
So I think you said, how do we make wine out of water? I think that's what you said there, right? So if you recall, when I first started, I talked about the corporate interest. Race is a social construct. And what they've done more than any other area that I can think of in terms of farming, corporate interests have used the power of race and ethnic diversity as a tool to keep black small farmers or potential farmers and white small farmers or potential farmers fighting at each other over the racial question. You say 98% of the farmland is owned by whites. Well, if you think about that, probably 90% of that is owned by corporate interests and not just family farmers anymore. And many of them are being run out. So when you start talking about the governmental target of taking of black lands and how to repair for that, the biggest opposition would be small white farmers say, well, you didn't do it for me. While the large corporate farmers are laughing all the way at the bank because we're fighting each other over the peanuts that's left, when they are actually setting a standard that's not healthy for the ecosystem, our economy, or the health of individuals. And so that's what's really driving much of this from my perspective. It is the bait and switch. Corporate interests exploiting everybody, this concept of white supremacy, having people feel like they are more privileged than others, therefore causing people who have more aligned than not fighting for crumbs, while others are laughing to the bank. And that's just not a US phenomenon. We see it much clearer here, but that's a global problem that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. Corporate interests use the cultural tools to create tension among smaller farmers and communities so they can laugh to the bank.
But let me just add that there was a time in an earlier administration when the Secretary of Agriculture told farmers to go big or go home, right? Go big or get out. And so this is not, that's not invisible to my boss, Secretary Vilsack. He's really, really, really committed to building spaces and revenue streams and possibilities for small farmers, for new and beginning farmers. And I think you're right that that's an equity agenda in part and overlaps. It's not the same as the agenda to ensure that there's not race discrimination and exclusion, but it overlaps in a really important way. And I don't mean to say that the department is doing absolutely everything it can, but I do mean to say that that set of problems that you raise is not invisible, and that if you, like find a YouTube version of his whiteboard speech, which people seem to be really into, that's what it's all about. And so I think it's a great point, and I thank you for sharing it. And I think that it's an equity point and also a broad community point.
And I think it's a political and cultural point. We live in a very anti-democratic world right now where there is no line to truth. So I think history is becoming what people choose to make it. Mm-hmm. And the question of how we got here is becoming less and less obvious and less a part of the public conversation, because people are being able to manipulate history and to invisibilize the plight of what many of us and many of our families have gone through to get here to be in this situation. So I appreciate you for elevating that, and we need to have more of these real honest and transparent conversations about how we got here in the first place.
Okay, we have one final question.
Wait for him to speak.
Hi, thank you. Mark Muller with the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, and this has been fantastic. Thank you very much for everything you're all doing. My quick question is just regarding the Justice 40 initiative, and I've noticed like EPA seems to be developing new programs and doing different things to achieve the Justice 40 initiative. I haven't seen as much from USDA, and I might just not be familiar with it. So just curious what USDA is thinking regarding the Justice 40 initiative and how to implement that.
Yeah, let me, since I'm watching the time tick down and there's 24 seconds left. So let me do that last plight of the speaker, which is refer you to a website. If you go to usda.gov/equity, there is a page on there for the Justice 40 list of covered programs and for the environmental justice scorecard. And you will be able to see every one of those covered programs has a Justice 40 implementation plan that's designed to get 40% of the benefits of that program to the population that needs it, as the Justice 40 initiative requires. So I can't say more than that because now it's at 0, but that's where you can find a lot more information.
Okay. Well, with that, please, once again, join me in thanking our amazing panelists. Dr. Goldmon, Derek, Charlotte, Margot, we are together collectively reimagining a different world in which there could be a more fair, more just, more equitable, sustainable agriculture and food systems.